Hello, college football fans, and welcome back to the College Football Fanatics podcast. I am your host, Daniel, and this is week 8 for college football. We had a pretty big shakeup in the top 25 this past week. We had a couple of teams drop. We had a bunch of teams move up, and we had some pretty surprising games. And I want to go over the two most surprising games that I think we had in this past college football week, and that was Penn State and Michigan. So Penn State and Michigan is one of the games, and then the other game is Alabama and Tennessee, both of which were pretty awesome to watch for completely different reasons. So I'll start with Penn State and Michigan. So Penn State came into the week ranked at number 10, and Michigan came in ranked number 4. The spread was, I believe, 7. So Michigan was pretty much up by solely a touchdown, which was pretty interesting to see. And it was a really awesome game because Michigan just did 99% of their things completely right. There was a couple of plays where their defense wasn't ready for Sean Clifford to run the ball 65 yards. And he ended up doing just that. And they scored a touchdown off of that drive. And then there was one play where JJ McCarthy just threw a bad pass and it had an unlucky bounce on somebody's helmet. It popped up and the Nittany Lions just got it and ran for a pick six with that pass. But barring those two plays, Michigan was just an unstoppable force in this game. I mean, their running game was completely phenomenal. The Nittany Lions came in with one of the best running defenses in college football in the past 7 weeks, and they just looked completely lost when they were facing Michigan's running game. I mean, Blake Corum and Donovan Edwards ran all over the Nittany Lions defense. Part of it, I think, was that Penn State's defense was exhausted by like the end of the second quarter. They had barely gotten off the field, and the second half was even worse than the first. But it looked like the linebackers and the secondaries were just standing still next to Corum and Edwards. I mean, it just really looked phenomenal. This is a game that I think if Blake Corum is a top runner for the Heisman, I think this will be the first game in which the committee that chooses the Heisman winner will look at and be like, this was Blake Corum at his absolute best. He didn't run for 3 miles, but he ran for 100 and he ran for something like 160 some yards, 166 yards. And he was just the workhorse of that Michigan offense. Donovan Edwards only had a few more yards at 179 or 173. But Blake Corum, when you needed when it was 3rd and 4 and you needed 5 yards, Blake Corum was there to give you that 5 yards, and that was really important for this Michigan offense. That answered one of the questions that I had going into this week, which was, can Michigan's running offense beat a good running defense? Because we hadn't really seen Michigan go up against a really good running defense until now, and Michigan just made them kind of look a little silly all over the field there. JJ McCarthy didn't have his best game. He only threw for 145 yards on 17 completions with 24 attempts. And he did have an interception. He didn't have any touchdowns, but when you have a rushing attack that's getting you 400 yards in a game, you really don't need to throw the ball that much. Um, that's just one of the perks of having a phenomenal rushing attack. Um, I think Michigan went into the half with something like 18 first downs. And I think Penn State went into the half with 1 first down. Um, and I was reading an article. Speaking of going into the halftime, Michigan's stadium is built so that there's only one tunnel to come onto the field. It's the only tunnel there is. So both teams are going into the locker rooms at the same time, and they're also coming out of the locker rooms at the same time. And this was I think, a major factor in last year's Ohio State game, where there was videos circulating of Michigan and uh, Ohio State jawing back at each other while they were coming out of their respective locker rooms. And then Michigan came out to absolutely blast Ohio State in that second half, and it looked very similar to what went on here, because there were also videos circulating after this win of the Nittany Lions and the Wolverines both coming out at half, and they were jawing back at each other. I couldn't hear what they were saying in the videos, but as we know, these are college kids. They're probably not saying the most respectful things to each other. Um, so it was really interesting to see Michigan come out and score. It was 25 points during the second half, and Penn State only scored 3 off of a field goal. Going into the half, you have a 14-16 um, game, and if you stopped the game right there and turned off the TV and didn't watch anymore, you would think, oh wow, the ending score was probably pretty close. It was probably somewhere like 32 to like 30 or something like that, or something ridiculous, where it was really close. Um, like 32 to 28 or something like that. Um, but it wasn't. It wasn't even close to that. With the ending score being 41-17, it was an absolute blowout in the second half. So both teams were fairly clean in their penalties. Michigan had more penalties, but they only had 6 more yards in penalty yards. So the penalties didn't make that much of a difference, although there were questionable flags thrown. There were times where I was like, how is the ref getting this? Or is the ref completely blind? And that's in just about every football game. It's not just this one. It's in every football game ever played. There's never been a game where where fans or a player has come out and said, oh, that game was 100% called correctly. There's always going to be a call that's missed, or there's always going to be a call that somebody disagrees with. This was a time where I think both teams kind of got the raw end of the stick on this. There were times where, Michigan got penalties called against them that I didn't really think they deserved. There were times where Penn State got penalties called against them that they didn't deserve. So all in all, I think it was fairly well regulated, but there were some issues that I had with it. But the one thing that I think really shows the disparity between the two teams is the time of possession. Um, Michigan had 41 minutes and 56 seconds in time of possession, opposed to Penn State's 18 minutes and 4 seconds, which is which is obviously a pretty drastic difference in how the teams are being and how much the teams had. I mean, Michigan's defensive line looked phenomenal. Mike Morris and I think it's I think it's Taylor Upshaw. I could be wrong about that first name, but Upshaw is definitely his last name. Um, really stopped Michigan's or Penn State's running attack in its heels. I mean, one of the worries that I also had coming into this game was could Michigan's defense stop a good running attack, which Penn State has an effective running attack based on their previous six games, or sorry, previous 5 games, and it was interesting to see. Um, it was interesting to see Michigan be really, really strong up front. I heard, I think I heard Josh Pate. It was either Josh Pate or Joe Klatt say that they thought that this year's defensive line was better than last year's overall. And while I think it's slightly worse, I can understand where Josh Pate, I think it's Joel Klatt actually said it. I think I can understand where Joel Klatt is coming, where he thinks, you really didn't hear a ton about defensive tackles last year. It was all about the defensive ends with Aiden Hutchinson and David Ajabo. But I still think that their combined 25 sacks makes up for what they might have missed on the interior. And I don't agree that last year's offensive line is worse than this year's offensive line. I can see an argument for maybe it being the same. Their strong suits are just in different areas, but I definitely do not agree with the idea that it's better than last year's. The other thing I wanted to talk about is over the off season, Mike Sanderstill, who was a wide receiver for Michigan, switched sides of the ball. He pulled a kind of Charles Woodson play. So he played a little bit of wide receiver this season, but nothing significant. And he's mostly played. I think he's mostly played DB, defensive back. He is looking really phenomenal. I mean, I came into the season thinking, okay, it's his first season playing DB. He's probably going to get playing time. It's not going to be a significant amount of time. It's not going to be, he's not going to have a ton of production. And I have been pleasantly surprised, absolutely pleasantly surprised in how much, he has grown into his position, how much playing time he's been getting. That shows a real awareness from Jim Harbaugh in where are my players most effective, where are they best positioned, and most and where's their utility best put. And it really shows the athlete that Mike Sanderstill is, because I don't know a lot of wide receivers who would take the chance, because he was a good wide receiver. I mean, he was a solid wide receiver. You needed 15 yards and you threw the ball to him, he'd likely come down with it. And I don't know a lot of wide receivers who they're playing well, they're doing what they need to do on the field, and they just up and switch over to defense, and then they're giving production on the defensive side of the ball. I mean, that shows a absolute maturity and skill that um, that Mike Sanders still has, and it's really showing. And I think by the time Michigan plays Ohio State, it'll be really interesting to see the player that he's developed into. Um, and it's just like with JJ McCarthy. He's going to develop, and I'm excited to see what those two players develop into. Um, Junior Colson is proving to be a real leader on the defensive side of the ball at linebacker. Um, that's pretty much all I have to say about it. He really is looking good. He's helping stop the run up top. Um, the cornerbacks and the safeties are doing their jobs in covering receivers and making sure receivers aren't wide open. This is a team that I think has a lot of speed. In my opinion, it's Michigan's fastest team that they've had in 20 years. So it'll be interesting to see how this speed stacks up against um, the Ohio State speed, with their wide receiver core and with Travion Henderson and all of their guys. So it'll be really interesting. Um, I don't think we've seen. Um, I don't think that this is the peak of what Michigan can do. Um, Over the past 7 weeks, we've seen Michigan get better and better. And once they started playing conference opponents where the challenge was a little more, um, they've started to really show up. This is a Michigan team that loves to go into half with a nail biting in a nail biting game and then completely pull away in the second half, which I think really shows that Jesse Minter, who is the defensive coordinator at Michigan, I think that's really showing that he has is flourishing in his role as defensive coordinator after Mike McDonald went back to Joe Harbaugh at the Baltimore Ravens after one season being Michigan's defensive coordinator. So it's really fascinating to see that. I still have concerns about Michigan's passing attack. They haven't needed it, and just like last season, they're probably not going to need it until Ohio State. Last season they needed it a bit earlier. They needed it. They won the game with their passing attack against Penn State last year by one touchdown. That was a nail biting game. Um, but they really needed it at Michigan State, which they ended up losing that game. But the passing attack was what really kept that game close. Um, and it was really interesting to see. So Penn State ended up having a third down efficiency of a third, 4 out of 12. So their fourth down efficiency was 25%, 1 out of 4. Michigan looked obviously much better with 11 out of 28, and 1 out of 1 on fourth downs. So that's really all I have to say about the Michigan Penn State game. The next game that I want to talk about that I mentioned earlier was Alabama and Tennessee. So Tennessee jumped up the rankings this week in beating Alabama. And while as a Michigan fan, I hate to see them jump above Michigan after Michigan dominated Penn State. I understand. As a neutral observer, I understand why they got number 3 and Michigan didn't. Um, they beat number 2, or sorry, they beat number 3, so they deserve to get number 3. This was a full blown. This was a full blown offensive game. I mean, when you have a 52-49 game, it's like there was almost no defense in that game. Um, you know, there's over 100 points scored in this game alone, so there's over 1,000 yards for both teams combined. So it was really interesting to see Tennessee win on a field goal. I was looking at some of the stats from this game, and one of the stats that really surprised me, that I shouldn't say surprised me, that really stood out to me, that I had seen in several other Alabama games, was that Alabama had 130 yards in penalties, 130 yards, as opposed to Tennessee's 39 yards. And so when you're looking at this and you're looking at that huge margin, you can understand how Tennessee would win this game. You saw this with Alabama when they played Texas. They had somewhere near 100 yards. I can't remember if it was over or not. I did make a reference to it when I talked about that game back in week what was it? Week 3 or something like that. When you have 17 penalties for 130 yards, you're never going to win a game. You're never going to win a game. And any football coach, whether it's Pee Wee level or professional level, will tell you that exact same thing. You cannot win a game when you have 130 yards in penalties, and when your total yardage is 569, because these penalties happen in critical moments that decide outcomes of games. Is it third down with 5 minutes left to go, you're down by a touchdown in the fourth quarter, and you have a offensive pass interference penalty that brings back your what would be a 40 yard gain. That's a serious issue. And if Alabama wants to have a chance at making the playoffs this season, which it has been made incredibly difficult so far, then they're going to have to clean up their game. I don't think I've seen an Alabama team with this bad of discipline. In I don't think I've seen an Alabama team with this bad of discipline since Saban's been there. And that's saying something. He's been there for like 12 years now or something like that. I think he came over in like 2012 or 2010. I can't remember the year, but he's been there a long time, and it's led to an Alabama dynasty. And after this game, I was talking to a buddy of mine on the phone, and we got into a discussion about Nick Saban, and is this the end of the domination that is Alabama? And he asked me that question, and initially my reaction was no, it's not, because we've seen Alabama teams rise and fall, and we've seen them win and lose games before. But as I thought more about it, we really haven't seen that. Since Saban's been there, it's been mostly a dominated. Alabama's mostly dominated the college football playoffs. I mean, last year was one of the first times an SEC team beat Alabama since they've had Saban. Um, and that was surprising. So is Alabama on a downward trajectory? Maybe, maybe. And as much as I hate to say it, I also love to say it. Because my dream scenario would be the playoff commission has a nearly impossible task of choosing between, let's say, 12 teams to choose for a 4-team playoff this season. I would love to see Alabama not make the playoffs. I would love to see it. Because we've just seen Alabama win too much. So it'll be really interesting to see how Alabama finishes the final weeks here against the rest of their opponents. So I want to talk about some of the teams who jumped up in the rankings and some of the teams who really dropped. So we already talked about Alabama and Tennessee. They dropped. Michigan went up by 1. Penn State dropped by 6. Understandable. USC dropped by 5. Also understandable. They lost. North Carolina State and Mississippi State both dropped by 8 in the rankings. So they're likely to, by the end of the season, probably not be ranked at all. North Carolina went up to 22. Cincinnati stayed the same. Kansas State stayed the same. Illinois went up by 6. So it'll be interesting to see Michigan play Illinois later on this season. Or I think Ohio State actually plays Illinois if I'm not incorrect this week. So it'll be really interesting to see how teams that we are looking at here look throughout the next few weeks. That shake up in the top 10, in the top 5 really is really interesting. It, from what I've seen, the odds have Clemson making the odds I've seen have Clemson making the playoffs ahead of Michigan if Michigan loses to Ohio State at the end of the season. That's going to be a hard decision because Clemson has played a few teams that are decent, but no teams that I think rise to the level of caliber to that. Tennessee, Ohio State, Georgia, even Alabama are at. So it'll be a difficult decision if, say, Clemson is like 11-0 or 12-0 at the end of the season, and Michigan is 11-1, and their only loss is to Ohio State, who goes on to win the Big Ten championship. So it'll be interesting to see what happens, what ends up happening there. So I want to talk about a few games that are coming up in the next week. So it's actually, sorry, it's no, it is week 8 coming up. Iowa and Ohio State. Iowa's currently 3-3. Ohio State is obviously number 2 at 6-0. They're gonna dog. I think Michigan and Ohio State are gonna dog it out for the next, the next few weeks, till literally the end of the season, and it's gonna come down to a final game between them, which I think should be pretty epic. Tennessee is playing UT Martin. That's I hate saying that games are like auto wins, but this is a game that Tennessee should pretty much blow out UT Martin. Um, Clemson plays Syracuse. They're both undefeated. Clemson 7-0. Syracuse is 6-0. This should be an interesting game. I think Clemson's going to end up winning, but it should be an interesting game nonetheless. When I talked about Clemson not having played anybody of substantial competitiveness, this is a team. This is a team that I think could give Clemson a run for their money in the ACC. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. They're playing at Clemson, though, and that Iowa Ohio State game they're playing in Columbus. So they're not. So Ohio State doesn't have to worry about traveling to. Doesn't have to worry about traveling to. To Iowa and possibly losing there like Michigan did earlier this early in the season. So Ole Miss and LSU, two teams that have a long history in college football, and it'll be interesting to see. It'll be really interesting to see how all of that ends up playing out. So next up, UCLA, Oregon, 9-10. This will be a really, really fun game to watch because, as some of you know, which it was announced a few weeks. It was announced, I think, in the off season that UCLA and USC are moving to the Big Ten at the end of the 2024 season, I believe. So it'll be really interesting to see just how good UCLA is against a fairly decent Oregon team. They're not as good as last season, but they're good enough. Texas plays Oklahoma State. Texas has 2 losses and they're ranked at 20, and Oklahoma State has 1 loss. This is a Big 12 matchup, so it'll be interesting to see. I keep saying it's interesting. It's hard for me to say another word, but it'll be really fascinating to watch this game. I think Quinn Ewers is back at Texas, so I think that should make a difference. And I think I actually think that Texas is likely to win this game. Although Oklahoma, it would not surprise me if Oklahoma State won. Oklahoma State is a good team this year, just like they were last season. Boston College and Wake Forest really isn't a huge game. Wake Forest is 13. It'll be interesting, or that'll be a fun game to watch. I like Boston College because I think Boston College does a lot with what they on most seasons. I think they do a lot with what they have, and they're not this powerhouse team that you see coming up over and over and over again, like an Alabama or a Georgia or a Clemson or a Michigan or Ohio State. I think that they do a lot with the recruits that they get, which I think they're usually 3-star recruits, 2 to 3-star recruits. So it'll be fun to watch. A game that I have no interest in whatsoever and that I don't think matters all that much is Memphis and Tulane. I think I had a family member go to Tulane. No, it was Bowling Green that they went to. It wasn't Tulane. I think I knew somebody who went to Tulane, and this is a matchup that if you have nothing else to watch at 3:30 on a Saturday, go ahead and watch it because should turn out to be a fun game to watch. Mississippi State and Alabama. Alabama, I think, is gonna crush Mississippi State, but Alabama has struggled with teams they just lost. So I think it's important to see how Alabama comes back from that loss. Are they going to come back completely deflated and not knowing what to do and completely out of it, or are they going to come back with a fury like Michigan did, or uh like how like how Georgia did. So it'll be fun to watch. Um, I think that game will tell a lot about the type of young men that Alabama has on their team, and the character of them. So it'll be fun to watch. Minnesota and Penn State. I think Minnesota is currently leading the Big Ten West. Um, I could be wrong on that though. It could be Wisconsin that leads the West. Penn State obviously just lost to Michigan. This is going to be another game just like Alabama. What type of men do they have? What's their character? Do they come back, looking all down and defeated, or do they come back um, with a vengeance? Um, and then Kansas State and TCU. Um, the Bullfrogs and I think the Wildcats. This is gonna be that's gonna be a fun game to watch at 8 o'clock. I'm definitely gonna tune into it. Um, I'm gonna switch off between Minnesota and Penn State and Kansas State and TCU, because the Kansas State and TCU game could have some real consequences into what type of bowl games they get into. So most of the teams I just mentioned are bowl eligible or either close to being bowl eligible. Um, so it'll this is all about now what bowls they get to. Um, I want to talk about um, the next thing I want to talk about actually is UCLA and USC. Um, it was announced that they are going to be joining the Big Ten um, in a couple of years. So I think it's at the end of next season they'll be joining the Big Ten. Um, this provides some logistical challenges for the Big Ten. Um, and it also provides some questions of, is USC, are they going to have, are their games going to be, are they going to be jet lagged during their games? Are they going to be, if they have a 9 o'clock or an 8 o'clock game, um, is it going to be, are they just going to be too tired to really put up a fight? Because they're basically going from coast to coast every week. So it'll be really hard, I think, on the young guys there. But it also brings up another question of, does the Big Ten restructure their conference? So right now they're separated into the Big Ten East and the Big Ten West. And most of the competition is in the Big Ten East. Michigan is there. Ohio State is there. I think Penn State, I believe, is also in the Big Ten in the Big Ten East. So it's not like there's a ton of teams in the West. Iowa, when they're good, they're in the West. Um, it's really hard though, because the question then comes up: do you move Michigan over to the West, and then what happens? If because it's like Michigan and Ohio State have always been the big teams in the Big Ten, and now is it just going to be they play each other, once a year at the end of the year, and then they play each other a couple weeks later in Indiana? And that'll be the big question, because there's really not another team that's going to completely fight for those two top spots if Michigan gets moved over, or if Michigan doesn't get moved over and they don't restructure. Obviously, the UCLA and USC will come into the Big Ten and they'll go to the West. And then you have two new blood teams fighting for that top spot. And now how do they fight? Are they automatically at the top, or do they fight with Iowa to see if they can get there? That asks those questions are really important to ask. Michigan has a bye week this week. Their next game is in week 9 against Michigan State, I believe. That one is let's see. So, so it's Michigan State. It's a night game at 7:30. That's going to be a blue out game for Michigan at Michigan Stadium. There's obviously going to be 110,000 people there, with Michigan having the biggest stadium in college, or in North America. I think they have the third largest internationally. So that'll be fun to watch. Ohio State and Penn State play in week 9 as well. I think this is going to reflect on how good really is Penn State and how good is Ohio State. We already know Ohio State's very good. The question just is how good, and depending on how good they are, is Michigan able to compete? I do believe that Michigan is built to beat Ohio State for a second year in a row, which is, in the past 20 years unheard of, because it's been like 2 decades since Michigan was really a powerhouse. I think it's been since the early Lloyd era that I think Michigan was the last time Michigan was a powerhouse. The last time they won a national title was 97 with Charles Woodson, I believe. So it'll be a lot of fun to see that. I think Penn State is currently favored, or Ohio State's currently favored, and I think Michigan is favored over Michigan State by like 10.5 points. So this is a really fun time for college football, because I think it's shifting from an era where there was one team that dominated to now you're having 5 teams dominate. And this is coming at the perfect opportunity where, in a couple of years, there's gonna be a 12-team playoff. And if there's 6 teams that are all similarly skilled, it'll be a real dogfight for what for who gets that national championship title. And fingers crossed for me, I'm hoping my Wolverines get that title. It's I think they've been improving every single week. And it'll be really interesting to see how where they come out at the end of the season. There's a tracker on ESPN.com. If you guys want to go check it out, there's a tracker for the top, I think it's like 12 teams to make the college football playoffs. What has to happen for them to make it? I've played around a little bit with it. I've seen, if Ohio State loses one game, do they make the playoffs? And I think it's like 50% that they make the playoffs, 50% that they don't. The tracker is based on an algorithm that shows previous times that the committee has voted on similar things. So it'll be really interesting to watch that and see what's going on with that. If you have time, I definitely suggest you guys go check it out. Another thing that I want to talk about, this is Michigan. Next week I'll talk a lot about recruiting. I'll talk about the rankings and what's going on there and who has been able to pick up who and who looks like they're going to commit where and things like that. Um, so that's going to be like my a little past mid-season report on that. But I do want to talk about one thing. Ronnie Bell is a wide receiver for Michigan. He was not ranked very highly. He's now basically proven to be Michigan's best wide receiver. He has, I think, something like 400 or 500 yards on the season. His younger brother just committed to Michigan, so I thought I'd throw that out there as a little preview to next week. We'll talk about all of the Big Ten teams and their recruiting. We'll talk about the SEC and their recruiting. So it might take 1 to 2 weeks for me to get through the major teams in recruiting, because I of course also have to talk about I also have to talk about the games that were played, because that's what you guys tune in for. You guys want to hear me talk about the games and have my take on them. So it'll be really interesting to see that. We don't talk almost at all about other sports on this podcast, but I do want to say I watch Formula One. And a couple of weeks ago, Max Verstappen, who is a driver for Red Bull, won his second world championship. So a big congratulations to him. That's a big deal in that sport. He's a great driver and likely will win another world championship next year, but that's for next year to see. So it'll be really interesting to watch that. And whenever something else big happens in another sport, I'll try and mention it on the podcast. But that is all that I have for you today. Thanks for listening. Come back next Wednesday at 11 o'clock to listen to College Football Fanatics. Again, we'll be talking about recruiting and the games next week. So thanks. Have a great day, and I will see you guys all again next